Now, joining us for this conversation, we have Mudge. He is the Central Africa Director at Human Rights Watch, focusing on Burundi, the Central African Republic, Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Rwanda. Thank you so much, Lewis, for joining us on One Slot.
Great. Thanks for having me.
And how is it going over there? You're in Montreal, I believe. How's it? And how is Valentine's Day? I mean, we've been able to steal your day so far.
Happy Valentine's Day to you. It's fine here. It's very cold. I was in the Central African Republic last week and it was a lot warmer.
Definitely. And of course, reading your profile, you've been to so many African countries, so I'm sure that you have so much expertise on this particular topic, especially the safety of journalists. And I'll begin because you are a human rights activist. Now, what can you tell us about this rising attack on freedom of press that has been recorded around the world and in Africa, to be precise?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're Human Rights Watch. We're a human rights advocacy organization, but we very much view journalists as human rights defenders. As you said in your introduction, journalists are in many instances on the forefront. They're the first line of uncovering abuse, of uncovering acts of corruption, of the misuse of funds, of any wide degree of abuses or crimes that are being committed. And in many instances, we have noticed, especially in the Central African context, these journalists are uncovering crimes that are being committed by state actors or people closely aligned with the state. And that really does put their lives in danger. So just, it's just really shocking. Just in the last few weeks, we've been going over cases from Burundi, from Rwanda, and from Cameroon, where 2 journalists were recently murdered. So, this is something that's very much happening in real time. This is something that, unfortunately, with a rise of human rights abuses across Africa, we're in Central Africa, we're seeing also journalists really be targeted and really have that target on their back. Because they're doing their utmost to do their job, which in many cases is to expose this abuse and try to tell people the truth about what's going on. And there's a lot of people that don't want them to happen. So it's really unfortunate. I've been at Human Rights Watch for 13 years, working on this region, living in or working on this region. And I have to say, we're looking at one of the most difficult times, in my opinion, for journalists across the scope of Central Africa.
Now, we're going to go deeper into all of that, but in your time as a Human Rights Watch, how often do you get reports of abuses against journalists, and what exactly are the common types? I mean, is it torture, is it physical abuse? I mean, we're in the digital age, social media bullying, what exactly are the cases that have been recorded?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because we're talking about killings, which is obviously the most extreme and the most dire. And before we get to that, there's always a raft of other types of pressures that are put on journalists. So it starts usually with messages to tell them to change their editorial line or to tell them stop investigating a certain issue. A lot of times it'll be sort of loose threats, whether it be on WhatsApp groups and social media. Social media has really amplified these threats. But whether it be on social media saying, we know what you're doing, we know who you are, we know where your children go to school. And then that gets ramped up. And what we're noticing a lot across countries that really are flirting with trying to go more towards an authoritarian model, we find the courts get involved. So a journalist can be summoned into the courts to explain some type of reporting. I'm just back this last week from Central African Republic, and you're really starting to see the Touadéra government in the Central African Republic use this tactic. Anytime something goes over the radio, over the television, or is in print media that the government doesn't like, they call in that journalist. This was something that has happened in Burundi over a number of years before the crisis in 2015. And what that does is that does 2 things. Number one, it just wastes the journalist's time. The journalist usually has to spend the day in court. But also it's a real message. It's a real message to that journalist to say, these are the consequences for the reporting that you're doing. And you need to change. And what we see oftentimes with these quote unquote sort of small, soft tactics is we see journalists really have to take the decision to self-censor. And I think the most demonstrative case of that is in Rwanda, where there are simply some red lines. There are things you don't talk about if you're a journalist in Rwanda. State security, challenging the government. These are issues that are just taboo. And journalists know that if they cross those red lines, they're going to pay the price.
Now, still looking at the fact that journalists are gatekeepers of the truth, and earlier on in your submission, you talked about the fact that journalists are in a way also human rights activists. You also mentioned the fact that most of these journalists that have been reported, the cases are as a result of the fact that they've been investigating governments. What other underlying reasons are behind this problem? Is it just between the state government, the state actors and journalists? Are there still other inclusions, underlying reasons for this problem?
It's not just state. It's not just the state actors. Martinez Zogo, we've seen his case was actually tied to allegations of corruption of someone who's close to the Biya government in Cameroon. So it's not only state actors, but most of the time it is. It's usually you're touching on someone, an individual or an entity that has those connections. I think fundamentally what this comes down to is questions around impunity. When Martinez Zogo was killed, brutally and very gruesomely tortured before he was killed, the individuals who thought they could do that did so because they thought they could get away with it. They clearly felt that it was worth the risk of this terrible and horrific murder to send this message about what investigative reporters can suffer if they go too far. And they thought the risk outweighed the other risk of being held accountable for their actions. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is in these cases of people being targeted for having criticized the state, we are seeing that very rarely are those individuals held accountable for their actions of intimidating journalists, threatening journalists, and doing them actual harm. So, it's not necessarily, journalists against the state. We also see this with non-state armed group actors in countries that are going through sort of civil wars like the Central African Republic. But in overwhelming majority of cases, it is. And then the difficult problem is that you don't see the accountability after the fact. You don't see the judicial systems take these acts of aggression importantly enough to merit action, which only eventually fulfills the cycle, and you'll see more journalists put at risk. So, really at Human Rights Watch, number one, we absolutely view journalists as human rights defenders. We put them in the same category. And number two, at Human Rights Watch, we push hard for accountability for people who threaten or put the lives in danger or who take the lives or injure journalists, because it's really only through accountability that actors are going to realize that there's a price to pay for these actions.
Now, looking at statistics from 2022, the numbers are increasing. Journalists are disappearing, forced disappearances, torture is all going on. And as a journalist, you come out with a report and you get loose threats, like you rightly pointed out, and says, if you continue with this story, your life is at stake. What effect does it have on the society at large when you have journalists being threatened from doing their job as gatekeepers of the society?
Well, it's a terribly negative effect for the society. And I think what's important to highlight is that not only are journalists doing these reports and getting them out, and then they get those threats, but this is not a very lucrative industry. These journalists are, in many instances, paying for a lot of their expenses out of pocket. Journalists the world over, not only in Central Africa, but the world over, including Central Africa, are doing this because it's a labor of love. They enjoy the investigative nature. They enjoy getting to the truth and telling the truth. And so they don't get the protection that someone from an NGO like Human Rights Watch would get, just for example, to speak to my own organization. They don't get that type of protection. They're very much on their own. And a lot of these news industries are really, economically, they're not able to provide them with any degree of protection. And to your question as to what happens to society, look, it's really simple. People get their information from media. And if you're not getting it from legitimate journalists, you're going to be more susceptible to getting it from, intoxicating fake news that comes out on social media, You're going to be more inclined to listen to politicians who might be telling you an untruth. Journalists really are the stopgap to enable people to understand how policies are affecting their lives, how a government might be affecting their lives, how issues around corruption or nepotism or clientelism might be affecting their lives, in order to enable those people to affect some degree of change. And if that is taken off the cards, if journalists, are seen as simply, one aspect of society, but not necessarily a critical one, and if we lose it, then no big deal. It will absolutely, at the end of the day, it'll be the society at large that suffers. They're not going to know what's happening in their own country, let alone in their own city or down the block. And they won't be able to make appropriate decisions based on that information.
Now, looking at the devastating effect that these has on the society, are there laws guiding the safety of journalists? What has been done by governments to ensure that these journalists are safeguarded?
We're made up primarily of a bunch of lawyers, and we love laws. We love the framework that a good law provides. But just as I was alluding to earlier on the accountability issue, you'll have countries that do have very, very progressive press laws on the books. But the question is the application of those laws. You're not getting those laws enforced. You're not getting those laws taken seriously. So take Central African Republic, for example. This is a country that has some very, very good press laws on the books in relation to a recent constitution that came out in 2016. So a very new constitution. They were able to get a lot of really good ideas in that, really good language around freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and there's applicable mentions to a new penal code in which the press law is taken into account, really affording journalists the right to do their job. But what we see on the ground is that it's just completely different. The way that state actors are able to operate with impunity means that those laws, while very, very good on paper, are at times almost meaningless on the street because they're simply not enforced. So it really just comes back to this question of the government has to, A, allow the judiciary to act independently and hold people accountable, and B, it really does have to get to a point where its own laws actually mean something.
Now, there are laws to safeguard journalists, but in a situation where governments have not been accountable enough to make sure that these journalists are safeguarded, I mean, that's why we bring about international organizations. We have the Human Rights Watch trying to make sure that these laws are safeguarded. But we also have one of them, the UN Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists, talking about international organizations coming in to help journalists. How effective has it been for Africa?
Look, I think the UN, the Plan of Action on Journalists, has, had value as much as many UN programs do have value in Africa. At the end of the day, the UN, like the African Union, is made up of member states, and rightly so. At Human Rights Watch, we're big supporters of the UN. We're big supporters of UN initiatives across a variety of different spectrums. But fundamentally, to protect the journalists, it can't be the UN that comes in and does it. It has to be the job of the journalist has value in the country that he or her are operating in, and that the government has recognized that it's more important to enable that person to do their job safely than it is to get to a point where you're uncomfortable with what they might be looking into. And unfortunately, you see some of the presidents, Paul Kagame, some of the other presidents, Biya, some of the presidents on the screen next to me. Unfortunately, I think many of these heads of state, they're entrenched. They've been in their positions of power for a very, very long time. You do see a dynamic across Central Africa where there's a demographic of youth building up. They want to express themselves. They want to have different ideas. And you're seeing a real quash down of that sentiment. And that is stemming and being manifested through a pressure on journalists. Nobody, a lot of these rulers don't want to hear from journalists if the journalists are telling them things that they don't want to hear. And if they're if you talk about a president who's been in power since the 80s or 90s, and a journalist starts to sort of demonstrate why that might be going against the democratic principles laid out in the country's very own constitution, and highlighting that to the population, you can see how that journalist might get in a lot of trouble.
So what happens when governments fail to do that? I think I'm going back to the same question, because you talk about governments who have been there for years and they don't want to hear you say something bad about their administration. What happens when they fail to do all this?
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge for folks like us at Human Rights Watch, because, take Martinez Zogo, for example. There has been a little bit of movement on his case in the last week, very little. But you're talking about an incident that happened in Yaoundé in Cameroon, and Cameroon has pretty high levels of impunity for these types of crimes against people who are perceived as being against the government. And so, what pressure can be exerted on Cameroon? At the end of the day, number one, we approach the Cameroonian government and we ask that government to abide by its own statutes and its own laws to ensure a safe place for journalists and to hold perpetrators of these crimes accountable, to send a message. But number two, you have to broaden out. You have to go to the African Union first and foremost. You have to go to Banjul, to the Commission of People's Rights in Banjul. You have to go to Addis Ababa and really push African states to hold each other accountable. There are some countries across the continent who really do value press freedoms. South Africa, for example, is a country that really does, I think, recognize the value of press freedoms. There's some other ones, some of them coming out of Southern Africa, Kenya, and East Africa. While it's definitely not easy to be a journalist there, they very much do push for their space. So there are some examples in which you can ask other African governments to hold other African leaders accountable. And then, to your point earlier, you broaden it out and you go to the higher level, to the UN. But these are bureaucratic structures. These are heads of state who don't want to be perceived as criticizing another head of state. These are, many times you get a very weak statement that's very watered down, and that doesn't really get to the heart of the matter. And so it's a long, hard road. But fundamentally, what we try to do is we really try to almost shame governments in which their journalists are being threatened. And this is all over the world. This is Human Rights Watch's work all over the world, not just in Central Africa where I focus, but this happens everywhere. We have journalists here in the United States who have problems. And so, we try to shame governments into really highlighting to the people that they're putting pressure on individuals who are just trying to tell the truth.
Now, as a member of Human Rights Watch, I wonder some of the challenges that you face. For we journalists, sometimes when you're facing harassment from the government, you're also afraid of coming out to speak bad against the government. So what are some of these challenges as Human Rights Watch that you face? You have most journalists come out and say publicly and tell you, I would want to come out here and say this government has been repressive to me as a journalist. Do you have that, or do you still have restrictions from journalists?
Yeah, it really runs all across the spectrum. Sometimes we get journalists who have said enough is enough. John Ntwali was a journalist who was murdered just recently in Rwanda. We knew him very, very well. We spoke with him. And, to be perfectly honest with you, we said to him on numerous occasions, John, it's getting too hot. You really do need to think about getting out. And he decided to take the chance. He said, no, this is really important. My job's important. He denounced a lot of things that were happening in Rwanda. We could dedicate the rest of the show just on what's happening in Rwanda with regard to press freedoms. And he paid for it with his life. There are other journalists who come to us at Human Rights Watch and say, look, I'm going to tell you everything that's happening. And that's going to explain why I have a byline that I do, in which I don't push certain issues. I mean, even the quote unquote pro-government journalists, they know they're not stupid. These guys are smart and they're in their job for a reason. They know what's happening. They've made a decision, and it's very easy to say, oh, so-and-so is pro-government or so-and-so is editing their byline. If they're being threatened, or their family has been threatened, you have to take seriously what they're saying and why they've made that decision. And we have a lot of sympathy for those folks. But we certainly do get journalists who want to tell us privately, but we cannot actually print their names. So sometimes we're in the unfortunate position of saying, person X told Human Rights Watch that he or she was under pressure. But then sometimes we do get the journalists who do want to come out and speak publicly, either as themselves or as their press body, about the pressure they've been facing. But I have to tell you, unfortunately, in numerous instances over the last 13 years I've been at HRW, we've also had to be in a position where we don't facilitate, but we certainly advocate for journalists to seek safe haven. in a third country where the pressure is just simply too much and they have to leave. And that's just terribly unfortunate. Not only are they leaving their home country for a set period of time, but you're also depriving the people of that country of that individual's reporting.
The pressure is definitely getting worse. And Lewis, we'll take a quick break right now. When we come back, you've mentioned some names, John Wale, Martina Zogo. They cannot just be put in the books. We still have to discuss such cases, and even cases that are still in law courts, and we've not gotten proper prosecution or a proper trial for all of this. So we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we will still be on One Slot, and we'll be looking at the fact that at Lewis Mudge, we're talking much more about situations in Central Africa where we have series of cases, both head off and unheard of, that Lewis is going to be talking to us about. So do stay with us.
News Central TV, Africa's #1 storyteller, has come with the best of both worlds. With a combination of news app and live TV, we ensure that you keep track of the latest headlines, breaking news, and in-depth analysis from professional journalists from around the continent. Download the News Central TV app on Android and iOS and get started today. Don't forget to follow us on News Central's social media platforms. News Central, Africa First.
And the world we live in today, journalists have indeed been added to the list of endangered species. The litany of death warrants the urgency for the physical safety of African journalists and the need for strong policies that prevent, investigate, apprehend, and punishes offenders are still a major topic around the world and also in Africa. And still with us in One Slot, we have Lewis Mudge, Central Africa Director at Human Rights Watch. And right now, we will be focusing on the various cases of journalist torture and harassment in Burundi, the Central African Republic, Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Rwanda, which Lewis, of course, focuses on. I mean, you've been in Africa on and off for about 13 years. That's a long time, I must say. And one of the cases, I'm going to start with Burundi because I saw this information of a journalist, Florian Inangabiye. I'm sure you're familiar with that name as a Human Rights Watch member. Now, she was sentenced to 10 years in prison early this month, and the charges were against her. In fact, a lot of people have been talking about this, that these charges were actually trumped up against her. So what exactly were these charges against her, and has there been any update on her case? Because I've seen lots of human rights publications on why Florian should be given a 10 years imprisonment for trumped up charges, so they say.
I mean, this is Florian's case. We did a report on this recently. Florian's case is just an extension of just the way the media atmosphere in Burundi has completely closed. For listeners or watchers who might not be aware, Burundi up until 2014, 2015 was really a beacon in Central Africa of freedom of expression and freedom of association. Burundi had numerous independent radio stations, numerous independent print journals, and Bujumbura really was considered this amazing mecca for people to criticize the government, even though it was repressive in some ways, but to criticize it and to call it out. And it was news that was absolutely consumed by the general population. That changed in 2015, and you saw an absolute crackdown on journalists in shocking ways, whether it be murders, whether it be forcing them to leave, convictions. We've seen journalists just disappear. We're still working on some of the cases of journalists who've disappeared. In some instances, it's been years. And Florian is just the latest iteration of that type of pressure. Florian's case, the specifics of it, I mean, we can go over them, but they're so trumped up that they're not really worth discussing. She's basically accused of being a spy for things that were said on her radio program. And they found one picture of her at an event in which Rwandan President Paul Kagame was present, and it was almost like one of those selfies that one takes. She posted on social media like anybody normal person would do, because it's not every day that you're at some event and the president is there. And they use that as this sort of smoking gun proof that she's a spy. It really is just one of these, and she's facing a 10-year sentence. This is one of those cases in which the prosecution just took whatever it could and threw it at the wall. The case was really empty from day one. And the judges went along with it. The judiciary in Burundi is not independent, and the judges went along with it, and they convicted her. Now, I think the saddest part about a case like Florian, we were talking earlier about the government's response, and the saddest part about the case of Florian, in my opinion, is not that, it's that she was given a 10-year sentence, but she'll probably be released. The government in Burundi likes to get journalists and human rights defenders and detain them, and then almost use them as pawns, and they will release them. But they'll only release them if there's some type of concession made in some other venue in terms of like sanctions or in terms of economic assistance to the country. So I imagine Florian will not spend 10 years in prison. I imagine she'll be released in the next 2 to 4 years. But she is viewed purely by the government of Burundi as a pawn, as someone who is a journalist. Therefore, let's lock them up on trumped-up charges and let's keep them at the side. And in case we get into a situation with other governments, we can say, well, look, we'll release this journalist that you've been pushing us on. We'll release her. So, it's just another one of these cases in which, they not only are trying to stifle any degree of dissent, any degree of criticism, any degree of independent thought, but they're also playing into this tactic of arresting these journalists, holding them in detention, and then releasing them to get some type of concession.
Now, it's quite sad that journalists have been made a pawn in terms of political arrangements and governments. Now, I'm going to use her as a yardstick for a lot of female journalists, because we've also had series of stories of sexual abuse too, as a form of abuse on journalists. I mean, how much of a threat is it, and how many stories have you had? What exactly are the reports of sexual abuse on female journalists?
Yeah, we've heard them. I mean, look, I think if you look at it this way, journalists, especially in countries across Central Africa like the DRC, where there's a degree of violence, journalists take risks, and that risk is only amplified by magnitudes when that's a female journalist. So we very much, unfortunately, have documented cases in which female journalists have either been threatened with or have actually suffered assaults of sexual aggression. It's honestly, I think, some of the most difficult work I've ever done with these types of journalists or human rights defenders, because they acknowledge that they put themselves in some degrees in harm's way, only to suffer these consequences. This is something that we haven't documented too many cases of, but we certainly have in the Central African Republic and in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And these were acts of rape that were committed almost as revenge for the individual's editorial line or investigative line. So it really is seen as a means of punishing those journalists. So they really are in a wide raft of almost unspeakable crimes against people in the media field and journalists. The use of sexual assault and rape as a means of punishment really does chalk up there as one of the worst things that can happen.
Let's shift away a bit from Burundi. Now, you mentioned a lot of time in your earlier submissions, Martinez Zogo. I mean, that caused a real widespread across social media. A lot of people were condemning his death, even though there were still a lot of investigations surrounding all of that. Now, people accused or in connection of these murder charges, what exactly has been the update on this, and how is it connected with the death of a certain man, another journalist also, Jean-Jacques Olabibe? I'm sure you also heard of the names there. It's more like these two deaths were actually connected. Can you explain more about this?
Yeah, we think these two deaths are connected. We actually issued a report on this last week, making that connection. The fact is that Martinez Zogo and Jean-Jacques Olabibe, they knew each other. They did a lot of work together. And when Martinez was very, very gruesomely murdered, Jean-Jacques Olabibe was one of the sort of key journalists who was really pushing for justice to be done in his case. Really sadly, Olabibe was found murdered just a few days later, again in Yaoundé. It's almost shocking, and it almost, you almost find yourself saying, "Oh my gosh, what's next?" When the journalists who are simply reporting on the murder of one of their colleagues are also murdered. And a lot of this stems to a problem that's widespread across West and Central Africa, which is just absolute out of control corruption. And, you know, Martinez Zogo was known as issuing this radio program in Yaoundé. It was called Traffic Jam, embouteillage in French. And he would go through his reporting. He would go through how he took positions in his reporting, his online reporting, about the corruption, about the misuse of state funds, and about very, very high-ranking individuals, some of them with very close ties to the president, Paul Biya, and how they were profiting from this corruption. Martinez Zogo spoke often about the threats against his life. Very much like John Ntwale in Rwanda, I think personally he made a decision to go through it, you know, come hell or high water. He wasn't going to stop his work, and he paid the ultimate price. I think the case of Ola Baby is so tragic because all he was doing after Martinez Zogo was found dead was simply calling for justice and really trying to amplify that cry in Cameroon itself. And clearly, in our opinion, you know, there's a link to be made because there's very much it's alleged that people didn't like that cry and decided to silence it. And you can just think of the chilling effect this is going to have on journalists in Yaoundé and in broader Cameroon if there's no justice in this case.
Now, some people would say you should at least die for something. I mean, it's one thing to die, but at the same thing, the reason why you're dying, I mean, there should be a certain purpose. There should be an effect of the people that have died and have made historic changes in government. Martinez Zogo said he had compelling reports about embezzlement in public institutions. I believe you also mentioned the fact that Martinez Zogo actually came to Human Rights Watch and to you. Those reports, what have been done about it? Is it just going to lie under the books? What exactly are the plans to make sure that, okay, the reason why Martinez Zogo was killed is not just wrapped up?
I think that really hits the nail on the head. And I think what you'll find and what we have seen from some recent arrests is that the individuals who are named in these reports, some of them have actually been arrested or are being detained, haven't been officially arrested, but are being detained and questioned. Look, the fact is that Martinez Zogo worked on very, very sensitive dossiers. That highlighted massive corruption by very high-ranking individuals. And, you know, we've seen the reports. We certainly want that information to see the light of day. You know, it would be, I think, the biggest crime of all if those reports were sort of swept over and there was no justice for Zogo. I think for us, the next step is to ensure that the judicial process, which has started because the noise on this death has been so loud, to ensure that the next step is that there's an independent, fair, and transparent election. And through that election, we hope that will be the venue in which some of this reporting can come out. Otherwise, one could ask if Martinez Zogo's his death was not in vain.
Earlier on, when you talked about the situation in Burundi, you said so far it was a bit peaceful, especially for journalists, until 2015 when things turned around. For Cameroon, how would you rate the treatment of journalists so far? Has it always been like this under Paul Biya, or was there a tipping point?
I think the Zogo murder was it's just the horrific nature of it and the graphic nature of it. I think has shocked many people who follow this space in Cameroon. But no, it has not been a safe country. You had journalists arrested and detained for months at a time up in the far north who were doing reporting, but through that reporting were accused of collaboration with Boko Haram. You've had journalists in the very, very volatile Anglophone regions be arrested. You've had journalists go missing in Cameroon. So I would not say by any stretch that the media atmosphere in Cameroon over the last few years has been safe and free and fair. But the Zogo murder, he was such a prominent individual. He was saying that he was finishing this dossier, this report, on high-ranking individuals. And the means and way he was killed are so terrifying that this does go into a different category, I'm afraid.
Let's go over to Rwanda. You mentioned that in one of your submissions. And of course, we have the president there, Paul Kagame. You know, most times we talk about democratic government and then you expect that there'll be freedom of expression for this journalist, freedom of media, so to say. But unfortunately, it's not unusual for Rwanda. I mean, you have journalists who have gone missing from your report or end up dead in mysterious circumstances. Now, Rwanda's president, somehow you successfully stifled traditional media. We have Rwandan authorities. We've seen from your human rights report that them now focusing on YouTube, an online platform being used by journalists for information dissemination. You talked about it, that it's even worse, and somehow social media has allowed them to have more access to these journalists. Now, according to the crackdown that Human Rights Watch has been tracking, the government has become quite proficient at online censorship. Now, this is a new stage into all of this, and we're seeing that almost in some African governments, especially those who are ruled by military governments where there's been a coup. So what can you tell us about the current state of press freedom in Rwanda and the recent case of, okay, let's first of all go with the current state of freedom, of press freedom in Rwanda before we go to John Wally, who you've been popularly talking about. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, fine. Yeah, I mean, look, I say this as someone who lived in Kigali for many years. I raised my first child there. I was myself kicked out of Rwanda indefinitely in 2018, the third Human Rights Watch researcher to have been done so in the last 10 years. But I recognize a lot of the economic progress that Rwanda, under the helm of Paul Kagame, has made. But the facts are the facts, and the facts are really simple. This is not a free press environment. Journalists do not have the right to do independent reporting in Rwanda, full stop. And I would happily debate anyone who came onto your program to say otherwise. There are red lines in Rwanda, and when you go over them, you will eventually pay with your life. Now, on the bloggers and the YouTubers, it's really interesting. So what you saw over the course of the, I would say, mid-2000s was a real pressure start to exert on the print media. Kigali does have had a lively print media scene. And you saw that pressure really begin with the newspaper journalists. You saw assassinated killings, but you saw many more flee the country, and you saw a number of them just give up and retire. Then it segued into talk radio. So you saw, I would say from the sort of 2010-11 period on, you saw talk radio try to use that venue as a means by which to get information to the public, especially in call-in shows. And so you'd have, journalists around the table, and people would call in and say things. They would talk about detention centers. They would talk about torture. They would talk about, these are unlawful detention centers, not gazetted jails. But they would talk about how, family members are being taken away and had gone missing. And you saw a real crackdown on that subsequently, on those types of channels. And then as the networks got better across Rwanda, you saw, and this is, I would say, in the last five or 6 years, you've seen an increase in online platforms. So you've seen YouTube shows become very popular. You've seen journalists use WhatsApp and Twitter to really sort of get the message out there, because no big media house in Rwanda would cover these types of stories. They're all state controlled effectively. And so now what we're seeing is this crackdown in the digital realm. We're seeing the journalists like John and Twali, but there are others who tried to take to YouTube to do real reporting. I mean, they had real equipment. They did real reporting. So this isn't just some sort of crazy guy in the basement, just telling his opinion. Yeah. There are some of those, but most of them did real reporting. You saw that crackdown. And what the government stated, in a quite blunt way, which was basically that internet is not news. These aren't journalists. John and Twali, before he was murdered, he couldn't get his press accreditation. And so they really sort of delegitimized them in that sphere and said this is simply public commentary, not news as such. And so we're there now. We're there where we have seen time and time again in Rwanda, journalists try to find the venue where they can try to sort of get truth to the people, only to have those doors shut. So it really is one of the most closed countries on the continent, despite this international reputation that it's built as this sort of very, very economically advanced Central African country.
Now, looking at how far bad Rwanda has gone in suppression of free press, would sanctions actually solve anything? I mean, what is the way forward? Because I still remember when you're talking about Rwanda genocide, the media was being used as a tool against the people, and somehow there's still repression again of the media. So what exactly can be done? Would sanctions actually pave the way?
Well, I think you've touched on one of the RPF, which is the ruling party of Rwanda, one of their talking points, which is, you're absolutely right. The media was used by the Habyarimana regime and by the Interahamwe, especially Radio Mille Collines, to coordinate killers in 1994. That happened. But, the solution, our argument is the solution to despicable use of media is not to shut down media. If any country in the world has a legitimate right to want to be concerned about and to criminalize incitement to violence and hate speech, it would be Rwanda. But let's be frank, this show that we're on right now could not exist in Rwanda, could not be disseminated from Kigali. They don't, obviously it's fine to sort of be concerned about hate speech, incitement to violence, but they don't want meaningful debate, meaningful investigations, and meaningful criticisms. To your point as to what can be done, we've pushed this hard. I mean, Paul Kagame right now is the president of the Commonwealth Heads of State of CHOGM. Paul Kagame recently was the president of the African Union. Rwanda has a very good brand internationally, and they push that brand hard. They're on Arsenal's uniform. It's a very hard fight for Human Rights Watch to try to demonstrate that, yes, there are some good things happening in Rwanda. We don't deny that. I saw that firsthand. But at the same time, this is a quote-unquote democracy where anyone who tries to do any degree of independent reporting will inevitably have to either stop, flee the country, or be killed. Those are the three options if you try to do independent reporting in Rwanda. We try to highlight that to Rwanda's partners. We try to highlight that to either, the business ties. Sometimes we get some traction, but sometimes not. A lot of people are not necessarily concerned about the plights of journalists on an individual manner, and sort of tend to say, "Oh, Human Rights Watch, you're just exaggerating."
Now, closely related to Rwanda, I'm going to quickly wrap this up now. We know of the situation going on between DRC and Rwanda, where DRC blames Rwanda of sponsoring the M23 rebels. For DRC, what's the situation like for press freedom? I mean, this is one country accusing another country of trying to repress the citizens. How is press freedom in DRC so far?
Yeah, I would say, it's certainly a better outlook than Rwanda is. The country is so big with so many different regions that the Kinshasa central government is never going to be able to sort of clamp down totally on press freedoms. So I would say it's certainly better, but very much like Cameroon. You do have, especially on these issues of corruption, you do have journalists face enormous threats. When their investigations or when their reporting leads them in an unsafe direction. On M23 right now, we're actually very close to Goma. We're seeing history repeat itself. This happened 10 years ago, and we're seeing it again. On M23, I think for Congolese journalists, it's okay to cover that because the government very much wants that to be disseminated. What they're not covering as much, and what we wish they would cover, and what some have said is a problem to cover, is the rise in anti-Rwandan sentiment on the Congo side. And you're seeing that play out in ethnic lines. And so you do see, in some ways, journalists sort of recognizing and seeing the tea leaves and saying, well, I can write on this pretty easily and do my reporting on that. That other issue is going to get me in a little bit of hot water, so I'll skirt it for now. But by and large, I would say the outlook in the DRC is certainly more free and fair than neighboring Rwanda.
Now, in our very early submission, we talked about the effect of attack on journalists on the society. Now, what's your advice for journalists? I mean, you have been Human Rights Watch for a lot of years, and so far it kind of discourages journalists from going into the main stories, and somehow you go for just the surface. So what would be your advice at this point?
I think it's number one, it's not an advice, it's a plea for journalists to recognize that it's very easy, to be Human Rights Watch and to sort of be outside and come in. I mean, I was based on the continent for a long time, but, journalists are the ones who know the players, they know the context, they know the situations better than anyone, full stop. And for them to recognize the critical role they play. Number two, advice to journalists would be, there's always going to be some organizations that are there to help you. But at the end of the day, this is a labor of love. As I said earlier, people don't become journalists to get rich. They become journalists because they love the trade. And so it would really be to try to liaise with the international groups like Amnesty International, like CPJ, like Human Rights Watch, who are there to try to support them to the best of our abilities, but also to liaise with each other, to work with their fellow colleagues, to protect each other, to continue to do their work. Because if the work of journalists stops, how do human rights defenders, how do civil societies, how do the international human rights groups operate? It's going to be almost impossible for us to do our work. And then you really will see these authoritarian inclined governments go towards full authoritarianism.
All right, thank you so much, Louis. I mean, when you talk about the labor of love for journalists, I wonder what some journalists' bank accounts who are screaming right now. I mean, when you say it's just about the labor of the work, the love for the work, rather. But thank you so much for being on this topic. I mean, as journalists being gatekeepers, it's really important that they are safeguarded. Thank you so much. You're Central Africa Director at Human Rights Watch. You focused on Burundi, the Central African Republic, Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Rwanda. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on One Slot.
Thank you.